All right, this is Math 1513, Northern Oklahoma College, 1.2, Chapter 1, Section 2. This is an exercise for your homework problem number 29. It's actually number 30 in your book. It's a word problem. The price of a magazine rose 4% this year and now costs 26 bucks. I'm paraphrasing. How much did it cost last year? All right, let's see what kind of information we can pull from this problem. So far we know that the price this year is the price last year plus that increase that they had. So let's abbreviate a little bit. I'm going to call the price this year price 2011, okay? Now let's hold up a little bit and let's go back over sub numbers. This is P sub 2011. It's just a name, okay? Just a reminder that if I'd written it this way, that would be P to the 2011 power, which would be this humongous number. That's an exponent. That's not what we're dealing with. We're dealing with just a name. So I'm going to call it P 2011. I'm just naming it the price for the year 2011. That just kind of helps me make sense of the problem. So the price this year, which we're calling 2011, is in math almost always means equals. The price last year, well, I'm going to name this P, this price, 2010 for last year. You could use the word last if you want to. I mean, you could use the word this for this year, or the word last for last year. If that makes more sense to you, go for it. I'm just going to leave them labeled price 2011 for last year, or this year, equals price 2010 for last year, plus, okay, now, how do we calculate this increase right here? Well, the increase was a 4% increase. 4% of what? That's our question. Plus 4% of what? What did they increase? Well, they increased last year's price. They took last year's price and increased it. So the increase is going to be 4% of last year's price. All right, let's clean it up a little more. How do I write this a little shorter, a little abbreviated? Well, 4% I can change to a decimal. 0.04, you just drop the parentheses, move the decimal 2 to the left. Remember the decimal's right here. We just don't write it, and then we move it 2 spots to the left. So 4% changes to 0.04. Of in math almost always means times. And then P 2010. All right, let's abbreviate a little more. 0.04 times P 2010. We can leave that little multiplication dot out and just write it as 0.04 P 2010, or last year. Now, if we look at our equation, we see that we actually have like terms on the right. This is a P 2010 and this is a P 2010. So if we put those together, well, think about this as a 1 in front of that one. We have one whole price plus 4% of the price. When we add those together, we get a 1.04p. 1p plus 0.04p is 1.04p. I'm going to go ahead and put the name on it, the label, and bring down price for this year, 2011. Now at this point I'm kind of stuck. I have two variables, which is never good. Okay, there's a variable and there's a variable. I have two unknowns. That's never good. So at this point I would go back to the problem and reread it and see if there's any information I missed. Well, they did tell us that the price this year, that's 2011, is $26. So I'm going to replace the 2011 price with what it is, $26, and bring down the rest. So now I have $26 equals 1.04 times the price last year. I simply solve for P. Remember that we had that times dot in there that I took out. Well, remember that it's still there. How do I get rid of times 1.04? I divide by 1.04. Same thing over here. My 104 is canceled. I have my P alone. I'll put my label back on there. So the price for 2010, or the price last year, is going to be $25. 5. Oh, sorry for all the silence. I forgot I was recording. I thought I paused, but I didn't. Anyway, answering with a number is good, but remember with word problems, it's always better to answer with words. All right, I'm doing an example for problem number 31 on your homework. It's actually number 32 in the book. I don't want to write it all down, so I'm just going to read it to you. A total of $7,500 is deposited into 2 simple interest accounts. In one account, the annual simple interest rate is 5%, and in the second account, the annual simple interest rate is 7%. The amount of interest earned for 1 year was $405. How much was invested in each account? All right, so I'm going to abbreviate the story problem. Basically, the interest earned by account 1, when you add it to the interest that was earned by account 2, you get $405. All right. The whole idea with word problems is translating them into simpler and simpler language. So let's translate this into math now. All right, I'm going to change some words to mathematical symbols. The interest earned by account 1. Well, I'm going to call that I for interest. Now I'm going to have more than one I, so I want to label it. I'm just going to call it I1. Remember, that's a sub, that's a name, I sub 1. So the interest earned by account 1 is all represented by I sub 1. Then we have our plus. Well, that's easy enough. Plus. Then we have our interest earned by account 2. You can guess what's going to happen here. I'm going to name it interest in account 2. So the interest in account 1 plus the interest in account 2. You guys remember the word is almost always means equals in math. And finally, 405. So look, that cleaned up pretty nicely. Okay, so it's pretty easy to simplify our overall goal. Our overall goal is to figure out the interest earned by account 1, figure out the interest earned by account 2, and then making sure it equals 105. Let's talk about the interest earned by account 1. All right, the problem said the account 1 earns 5% interest. So 5% of what? It's 5% of the amount invested in account 1. Now, we don't know how much was invested in account 1. So what are we going to call that? I'm just going to call it X. I don't know how much we put in account 1 yet. We're trying to figure that out. So I'm going to call it X. What about the rest of it? Interest earned in account 1 is 5%. Remember, we changed percents to decimals. 0.05. And remember, of in math almost always means times. So simplified, our interest in account 1 is calculated by taking 5% of the amount of money that was invested in account 1. Okay, the interest earned by account 2 is calculated in a similar way. So the word problem says the interest in account 2 is 7% of the amount invested in account 2. Well, how much was invested in account 2? Was it the exact same amount that was invested in account 1? No, they were two different amounts. So I called the amount in account 1 X, but since there's a different amount in account 2, I'm going to have to use a different variable. So I'm going to call it Y. So the interest earned in account 2 is 7% of the amount invested in account 2. Remember, the Y stands for how much we put into account 2. Okay, back to our original problem. The interest earned by account 1 plus the interest earned by account 2 equals $405. Now, we just decided that the interest earned by account 1 is the same thing as 0.05 times the amount put into account 1. And the interest earned by account 2 is the same thing as 7% of the amount put into account 2. and they're two different accounts, so we use two different variables, x and y. And that has to equal 405. Now later on, we're going to learn how to solve equations with two variables, but for now, we need to rewrite this so that we're either dealing all with x's or dealing only with y's. All right, to do this, I have to think about how x and y are related. Remember, x is the amount of money invested in the first account, and y is the amount of money invested in the second account. Now, if I go back and reread the problem for more information, I know that the money I invest in the second account, or first account, the money I invested in the first account plus the money I invested in the second account is going to be equal to a total of $7,500 invested total. So I put some in account 1, I put some in account 2, and together it's going to equal $7,500. All right, I need to either get the x alone or the y alone. It doesn't really matter which one. I choose x. So I want the x to be alone, so I'm going to get rid of the y by subtracting y from both sides. Now I have x equals 7,500 minus y. Okay, how does that help me? Well, since I know that this, 7,500 minus y, since I know that that is the same thing as x, I'm going to go back to what was giving us trouble here, and I'm going to replace that x with 7,500 minus. So now I have 0.05 times 7,500 minus y. Remember, it used to be times x, but we took out the x and put in 7,500 minus y, plus 07y, 7%, equals 405. I'm going to distribute the 0.05, multiply everything in the parentheses by 0.05. I get 375 minus 0.05y plus 0.07y. Remember to keep both sides separate. I have like terms right here. I have a y and another y that I can put together. So now I have 375 plus 0.02y, because it's 0.07 minus 0.05, equals 405. Remember, when you have a choice of what to get rid of what's furthest from your y. All right? This is a plus 375. How do I get rid of plus? I minus from both sides. My 375s cancel out. I have 0.02 times y. How do I get rid of times 0.02? I divide. And 02's cancel out. And y equals 1,500. All right, think you're done? You're not. We found out what y is, but we have to answer the question. That means we have to know everything about both accounts. So 1,500, what does that mean? That means that $1,500 was invested in the second account, the one that was making 7% interest. We still have to figure out how much was invested in that first account, the one making 5% interest. All right, go back in your notes and remember when x equals 7,500 minus y, we can use that equation to figure out what x is. So x equals 7,500 minus, well, instead of y, let's use something that means the same thing as y. Let's take that 1,500 and put it in place of y. We're going to substitute. Okay, now do the math. And x equals 6,000. Now true, you found out that x equals 6,000 and y equals 1,500. But since it's a word problem, you need to explain to me what that means. So $6,000 was invested in that first account. And remember, that account earned 5% interest. And $7,500 was invested in the second account at 7% interest.